Massachusetts PFAS law is gaining early momentum. Environmental risk has traditionally been managed through a familiar division of labor. Regulators set limits, utilities and operators manage treatment, and companies focus on compliance within defined boundaries. Legislation introduced in Massachusetts suggests that model is beginning to change. At the end of 2025, Massachusetts lawmakers advanced a sweeping PFAS bill that does more than target a single class of contaminants. It reframes how responsibility for environmental contamination is understood, placing greater emphasis on planning, infrastructure constraints, long-term liability, and public accountability. For executives and boards, the signal is not subtle. Environmental oversight is expanding. What makes the Massachusetts bill different? The Massachusetts legislation is notable not just for its focus on PFAS, but for what it formally acknowledges. The bill recognizes that PFAS contamination in wastewater sludge is widespread, persistent, and, under current treatment technologies, effectively unavoidable. That recognition drives a very different regulatory response. Rather than relying solely on tighter limits or incremental treatment upgrades, the legislation calls for comprehensive statewide planning, long-term infrastructure strategies, and new funding mechanisms to address contamination that cannot simply be treated away. It also reshapes liability, drawing clearer lines between producers, distributors, and downstream users of contaminated materials. This is a departure from traditional environmental regulation, which has often assumed that technical solutions would eventually catch up to regulatory ambition. From compliance to oversight, one of the most important implications of the Massachusetts bill is what it suggests about the future role of compliance. Meeting regulatory thresholds is no longer treated as synonymous with managing environmental risk. Instead, the legislation emphasizes system-level questions: where contamination originates, how it moves through infrastructure, and who ultimately bears responsibility when existing systems fail to contain it. For organizations that rely on municipal wastewater systems, biosolids management, or shared treatment infrastructure, this approach introduces a new layer of exposure. Environmental risk is no longer confined to direct emissions or discharges. It extends into planning assumptions, supplier relationships, and long-term asset decisions. Why this matters beyond Massachusetts? While the legislation applies at the state level, its implications extend far beyond Massachusetts. The state has often served as a proving ground for environmental policy that later shapes regulatory approaches elsewhere, particularly when federal standards leave implementation questions unresolved. Federal PFAS rules that moved into implementation in 2025 under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, established clear national expectations through enforceable drinking water standards and expanded oversight. What they did not fully address was how compliance should be achieved when treatment technology and waste systems cannot effectively remove PFAS. Massachusetts legislation steps into that gap. Rather than assuming technical fixes will catch up, the bill emphasizes planning, infrastructure constraints, funding, and accountability, translating federal PFAS policy into practical oversight. In doing so, it offers an early preview of how other states may operationalize federal requirements for PFAS and other persistent contaminants. For multi-state operators, this creates a familiar challenge: uneven regulatory landscapes combined with rising expectations for consistency and transparency. Organizations may find themselves compliant in one jurisdiction while facing broader scrutiny in another, particularly as states move from adopting federal standards to defining how responsibility and cost are allocated in practice. Broader implications. The Massachusetts PFAS bill underscores a shift that many boards have already encountered in climate and supply chain discussions. Environmental issues once considered operational are becoming governance issues. Key questions are moving upward. How resilient are our environmental strategies if regulators acknowledge current technology limits? Where do infrastructure dependencies create hidden exposure? Are we prepared for planning-based regulation rather than threshold-based compliance? These are not questions that can be answered solely within EHS or facilities teams. Massachusetts PFAS legislation is less about a single contaminant than about a changing philosophy of environmental oversight. It reflects growing recognition that some risks cannot be managed through traditional regulatory levers alone. and that accountability must extend beyond point of compliance thinking. For organizations watching regulatory trends, the lesson is clear. Environmental oversight is becoming more systemic, more anticipatory, and more closely tied to governance. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.